when we were thinking about what's a great example of civility, incivility of what's going on in politics, our neighbor to the north and east of us in Wisconsin came to mind. And as we were searching out where to go, and I have a conflict of interest, I must share right from the beginning, I'm from Milwaukee originally, and so have a little interest in Wisconsin and keeping track of what's going on up there. But the path of looking for a good speaker led us to our speaker today, and to introduce him is Tom Rice. Tom is Associate Provost here at the university, and appropriately enough, former chair of the Department of Political Science at Iowa. He's been at Iowa State, has been at UNI, so the regents should all be happy that we're bringing everybody together in one person.
Thank you, Pete. Actually, I have been at all three institutions, and today I'm a Hawkeye fan. It's wherever I am, I'm a fan of that school. I've been to all three. I like them all a great deal, and can't say enough about them. And sometimes, the incivility spills over into how we think about our sister institutions here, especially on the football field. And I try to remind people that we're all Iowans, and these are our universities, and they're really all great places. I am a political scientist. And although I'm not doing a lot of political science in this job right now, I remain interested and fascinated in politics. And therefore, I have a lot of interest in this conference today. And I want to thank Pete and all the others who had the vision and put in the hard work to make this possible. Our speaker this morning is Mike Gousha, who worked for 25 years for, I got to get the initials here right, the letter, WTMJ-TV in Milwaukee, where he earned numerous recognitions for his journalism and his programming, won a couple of Emmy Awards, and also won, among others, the Carol Brewer Award for outstanding long-term contributions to his profession. Since 2007, when he left the TV station, he's worked for the Marquette University Law School in a capacity where he is a distinguished fellow in law and public policy, and in that role, he organizes and coordinates forums and conferences which address issues just like this, public policy issues. He also brings to campus political debates and newsmakers, and he serves as a moderator and a facilitator. And as I thought about this and read about what he does, I thought he really has kind of the perfect job. At least as a political scientist, I wish I had your job. And I might trade you if we could talk about that. But we're delighted to have him down here from Wisconsin, so please help me in giving him a warm welcome this morning.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks to Pete for the invitation to join you. Pete and I were commiserating about the fortunes of our brewers during the planning of this conference. Things did not end up quite the way we had hoped, but it was that common bond that we shared. First, let me congratulate the University of Iowa and the Public Policy Center on this terrific symposium. It's great to be with you. I felt privileged last night to have a chance to speak with Jim Leach and to hear his extremely thoughtful remarks, some of which I think you'll see reflected in my discussion about what's happening in Wisconsin today. I just wish I had something to contribute to this discussion because it has been so darn quiet in Wisconsin over the last 10 months that there's just not much going on. There's not a lot going on there. And interestingly, more is to come. Clearly, this is a very relevant topic for the people of our state. A friend of mine who runs a business publication in Milwaukee has suggested that we should no longer be known as America's Dairyland, but should change our name to America's Petri dish. Where we're headed in Wisconsin is not completely clear, but this much we do know. It has been a remarkable, historic 10 months. Historic recalls, a polarized electorate, Supreme Court justices not just figuratively, but literally at each other's throats. Wisconsin Congressman Paul Ryan, the House Budget Committee chairman, the Republican from Janesville, has called this the new normal in Wisconsin. In truth, Wisconsin is a very different place today than it was just 1 year ago. The argument that continues in our state is whether or not it's a better place. But what cannot be argued is that the primary change agent in Wisconsin is our governor, the Republican Scott Walker. He was elected just over a year ago, and last week, I want to show you how that anniversary was remembered. This is from WISN TV.
When Scott Walker was elected as Wisconsin's 45th governor 1 year ago today, he said he didn't know exactly what to expect from the job. But now he tells me he's ready to grade his job performance. Do you recall, what did you expect of your first year?
Well, I thought there'd be a lot of challenges. I mean, I knew we faced both an economic and fiscal crisis in the state, and I knew we had to act swiftly on it.
And that included his controversial cuts to collective bargaining, which triggered massive protests. But Walker says the law has also been an economic success in cities across the state.
Do you dismiss all of the criticism and concern and think of this more as a case where the end justifies the means?
Well, it's one of those where, again, when I talk to people and people who say, you know what, I would have liked it if you'd explained it a little bit better, but I'm glad the reforms are working.
Following his election, Walker said he had hoped to be able to bring Wisconsin closer together, but the divide continues and he now faces a possible recall.
This is not what you had hoped for. What went wrong along the way?
Well, you look, I mean, it's interesting. You look in January, even into the beginning of February, and the measures we pushed in terms of a job agenda had broad bipartisan support. Now, things changed, and I think a lot of that came from pressure from outside of Wisconsin.
What's your assessment? Grade the job that you've done so far.
Oh, I think overall, if you look at focus and determination, an A. I think you look at messaging, maybe a B minus, C plus. I wanted to push the state forward. I didn't know exactly how we'd get there, certainly didn't understand the kind of national influence that would come in and try and alter what we're doing here in Wisconsin. But in the end, I'd hoped we'd take some bold actions to get both our economy and our budget on track. And that's what we've done. We're just a slightly different path maybe than I thought we would have taken in the first place.
No question, a lot has happened, and I asked him what the highlight of this year has been for him. He said it was actually something unrelated to any legislation. He said it was an event at the governor's residence honoring families of those who had donated organs from their loved ones who had died in order to help others live. He said meeting those families was an amazing experience.
All right, a low point. Can you point to anything that was the worst moment?
Well, I asked him what his toughest day was during this past year, and he said actually it's the times early on when he saw the stress that the protests were putting on his wife and his family, and specifically that day early this year when a large crowd of protesters gathered right in front of his house in Wauwatosa.
So that's our governor 1 year after his election, and let's begin there with the November election of a year ago. And I'd like to also begin with a brief mission statement for today. I'm a fellow in law and public policy at Marquette University Law School. I'm not an attorney. I'm a journalist. We actually have two of them working at the law school. We explore important issues of the day as part of the law school's expanded mission. I have reported on Wisconsin politics for about 3 decades now. And I currently host a weekly statewide television program where we talk politics and policy in a civil way, I might add. I am not here to pass judgment on the decisions that have been made in our state, just to tell a story. And this story is about dramatic change in both policy and in political discourse. The changes, as we just saw in that video, began in November of last year when then Milwaukee County Executive Scott Walker defeated our mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett. The vote was fairly close. The Republican Walker won by about 6 percentage points or so. But almost as significant, and really the underreported story of that election cycle, was the fact that the state legislature, the composition of the state legislature changed greatly. The outcome gave Republicans solid majorities in both houses. And that gave the soon-to-be governor the opportunity to remake Wisconsin. And as he would say, in a bold new way. I think we can probably, all of us in this room, agree that Scott Walker, and I think he would agree with this, is not a Republican governor, a Wisconsin Republican governor in the tradition of fighting Bob La Follette. He does not see the state's progressive ideals and strong labor tradition as being assets in today's competitive global marketplace. His goal, his stated goal when he took office was he was going to eliminate the $3.6 billion deficit that our state faced. And at the same time, he wanted to create a more business-friendly environment to make Wisconsin a place of lower taxes and fewer regulations. He promised that these new policies, this new agenda, would lead to 250,000 new jobs and 10,000 new businesses in 4 years, his first 4 years in office. And he wasted no time in moving forward with his pro-business agenda. Soon after taking office in January, he called an emergency session of the state legislature to focus on jobs, and a number of pro-business pieces of legislation were passed. They were approved very quickly, often with the help of Democrats. It was all in all a very promising start for the new governor. And then in early February, the governor, as he would later refer to it, dropped the bomb. As part of his plan to eliminate the state deficit, he proposed the elimination of most collective bargaining provisions for most public employees. Firefighters and police officers, unlike Ohio, were excluded in that legislation. Public employees would have to pay more for their health care coverage. They would have to contribute more toward their pensions. Dues would no longer be automatically, union dues would no longer be automatically deducted from paychecks. Unions would have to recertify each year, the public employee unions. Pay increases could be the subject of collective bargaining, but with this caveat, the increases could never go beyond the rate of inflation. The governor said no one in the state who had been following his campaign or had watched him govern as Milwaukee County executive should have been surprised by his proposal. But reporters said they could find no evidence whatsoever during his campaign, and he campaigned for about a year and a half. They could find no evidence that the governor had ever talked about the elimination of most collective bargaining provisions for public employees during the course of that campaign. I spent 3 hours with the governor in 2 separate debates. Not once did we talk about collective bargaining provisions largely being eliminated for most public employees. But regardless of how you felt about whether that was a surprise or whether it wasn't a surprise, the Wisconsin political world, after that proposal was made public, would never be the same. In the months that followed, here is just some of what we've witnessed in Wisconsin. Huge protests, both inside and outside the state capitol. 14 of our Democratic state senators fleeing to the state of Illinois. Democrats shouting shame at their Republican colleagues on the floor of the Capitol. One even screaming into the face of a number of Republican lawmakers, "You're dead." The governor being punked, that's the only way I could describe it, being punked by a prank phone call. Wisconsin Supreme Court justices in a physical altercation, unprecedented, historic recall elections, an electorate deeply suspicious of election results and deeply divided on the way forward. And I have to tell you, this may be only the beginning. Those protests, starting in mid-February, quickly grew in size and fury. They were unlike anything that had ever been seen in our state before. They brought tens of thousands of people to our state capitol. People camped inside the Capitol, on the floor of the Capitol, for days on end, even weeks. Legislators who were trying to conduct business at the time could barely be heard over the deafening chanting, a lot of chanting going on, and nonstop beat of drums. It was a very loud place. Many of those in the crowd saw the move to eliminate most collective bargaining as unnecessary, as punitive, as an attempt to drastically diminish union political power. Union leadership said they would agree to pay more for their health care coverage. They would agree to pay more toward their pensions, but they could not accept the changes in collective bargaining. In their view, this was about protecting the core values and principles of Wisconsin. In fact, for them, it was a battle for the soul of the state. As many of you know, ours was the first state to approve legislation that created workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, collective bargaining rights for public employees. AFSCME, the Municipal Workers Union, was born in the state of Wisconsin. The Republican governor and legislature, though, and I should say a significant number of state residents, saw this battle quite differently. They said taxpayers in Wisconsin were at their limit, that the budget had to be balanced without one-time gimmicks, and they added that public employees, even with the changes, would still end up paying less than many private sector workers would toward their pensions or for their health care coverage. So the battle lines were drawn, and the political discourse went south in a hurry. Literally. The 14 Democrats in the 33-member state Senate fled to Illinois. Now, they were trying to delay action on the collective bargaining legislation. They were trying to find a compromise, trying to build momentum against the legislation. I think they felt that these protests would ultimately result in the governor backing down from what he had proposed. As one Democrat told me, we really didn't know how long we would be gone or how we would return. It ended up they were gone for 3 weeks. And yet, in sort of a bizarro world scenario, they were a visible presence on nightly newscasts, showing up in undisclosed locations, like the WLS newsroom in Chicago. showing up to criticize the governor and the bill. Republicans responded to the move by blasting the Democrats for leaving the state. The governor and GOP legislative leaders said the Democrats' behavior was shameful. Shame is the new favorite word in Wisconsin. It was shameful and an insult to thousands of state residents who didn't have jobs, and an insult to the ones who did but would have been fired had they walked off the job. The Republicans said the Democrats were making a mockery of the institution, and at various points during the standoff, Republicans urged the Wisconsin State Patrol to track down the missing lawmakers and physically bring them back to the Capitol. And they also threatened to withhold their paychecks. They said to get their paychecks, they would have to come back to the Capitol to go to their desks, because that's where the paychecks would be. Now add to this mix a bizarre prank phone call by a Buffalo blogger named Ian Murphy. He made a call to the governor's office. And somehow that call went forward to the governor. The blogger posed as prominent conservative donor David Koch. In the conversation, with the blogger really egging him on, the governor confidently laid out his assessment of the current situation. He explained that he had no intention of backing down, that he was not going to compromise on the collective bargaining proposal. And he also admitted that his administration had thought about planting troublemakers in the crowd to turn public sentiment against the protests, but that they had ultimately decided against it. The show I did with him, I asked him about that. I said, should a governor even ever be thinking about something like that? And he said it was not something that was seriously considered. It was just a suggestion on the part of someone. The tense standoff came to an end the second week of March when Republicans found a way around the impasse. They removed some fiscal language from the bill, and as a result, they now needed only a simple majority to pass it instead of a quorum. And so that they did. They passed it very quickly. In both the Assembly and the Senate, Republican lawmakers left under police escort again to the cries of shame from spectators and from their colleagues, Democratic colleagues. The damage from that bitter battle, based on interviews I've done with legislative leadership, has never been repaired. The Assembly Speaker, Republican Jeff Fitzgerald, and the Assembly Minority Leader Peter Barca used to be friends. That is no longer the case. It absolutely felt like a meat locker when we interviewed them at the state capitol. This was their first joint appearance at the Capitol since the protests. I mean, it was literally that chilly in the room. They don't like each other very much anymore. Lawmakers say there is very little trust on either side of the aisle and a great deal of lingering resentment from the battle. I've even had veteran lawmakers, a Republican from the Milwaukee area, tell me privately that new lawmakers, new legislators, are actually discouraged from working with members of the opposing party. The chasm created by the collective bargaining battle would only widen in the months ahead. What was predicted to be a fairly obscure race for Wisconsin Supreme Court suddenly became a referendum on the governor. While the candidates, the incumbent David Prosser and the challenger Joanne Kloppenburg, loudly proclaimed their judicial independence, special interest groups poured huge sums of money into the race, seeing Prosser as more likely to side with business interests, Kloppenburg a more likely ally of environmentalists. But even more important, it was expected that at some point the state's highest court would have to rule on the changes to Wisconsin's collective bargaining laws. Again, the special interest money was betting that Prosser would vote to uphold the new law, Kloppenburg would vote to overturn it. On election night, it first appeared that Joanne Kloppenburg had won, a very close contest. But because of the way the votes were tallied in a heavily populated Republican county just west of Milwaukee, thousands of votes weren't added to the final totals until late in the evening, and those votes went overwhelmingly to David Prosser. He quickly claimed victory. That prompted protests from the state Democratic Party and from others, and it also prompted claims that the election had been rigged, that in essence it had been stolen. An investigation by the state's nonpartisan Government Accountability Board and a recount found that was not the case, that the election was not stolen. This was simply a matter of a county clerk not doing a great job of reporting results. But this growing skepticism about election outcomes in our state is one of the more fascinating and I think disturbing trends in Wisconsin. On a public radio broadcast not long after the election, I was struck by just how many callers simply did not believe the nonpartisan agency that investigated the matter. They simply believed the election had been rigged. On the other side, in Wisconsin, you have Republicans today who believe, almost as an article of faith, that voter fraud is a major problem in our state, particularly in the Milwaukee area. A former U.S. attorney, Steve Biskupik, who was appointed by President George W. Bush, concluded that there was no widespread fraud. But to address the lingering concern, the Republican legislature passed a strict voter ID law, which will take effect this coming year. Polls show that law has strong public support, but Congressman Gwen Moore, who's the lone African-American representative in the Wisconsin congressional delegation, she's from Milwaukee, she calls it racist. She says it's a new form of a poll tax. But let me return for just a moment to our Supreme Court, because it was the court that produced the single most unusual, but perhaps most symbolic moment of the last 10 months. Shortly after the legislature passed the law eliminating most of the state's collective bargaining provisions, the matter was challenged in court. Everyone expected that. Democrats claimed that the state's open meetings law was violated, and a Dane County judge stopped the new law from being implemented. But the Supreme Court, acting quickly by the court standards, overturned the Dane County judge's decision by a 4-3 margin. Justice Prosser joined the majority in voting for the reinstatement of the new law. The High Court's ruling was certainly big news, very important news. But what we learned several weeks later created a firestorm all its own and was in some respects the best example yet of this new normal in Wisconsin. During an informal meeting of the justices on June 13th, the day before their decision on the collective bargaining matter, two of the justices, Justice Prosser and Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, became involved in a heated dispute. Justice Bradley claimed that Justice Prosser put his hands around her throat in a chokehold. Other sources said Justice Bradley came at Justice Prosser with her fists raised and that in a way of trying to protect himself from that, his hands made contact with her throat. This is quoting from the police report, so this is... The altercation, as you would expect, made headlines in our state. And it raised serious questions about the court's ability to do its job and to function as a cohesive unit. An investigation followed, but no charges were filed. Perhaps, though, at least to me and a few others, the most fascinating aspect of this incident was the following. 6 of the 7 justices, 6 of the 7, were in the room when that altercation occurred. But they could not agree on what they saw, what they witnessed. Indeed, they were divided in their recollections, much it seems as they are in key deliberations. The more conservative justices saw the incident one way, the more liberal justices saw the incident another. What happened in that room, perhaps more than any other incident, laid bare the continuing tension and division on our court that has been growing with each Supreme Court election in Wisconsin. Our elections for the High Court have become highly contentious, highly partisan affairs where special interest money flows like cheap wine, and these are in races that are supposed to be nonpartisan. The altercation in the justices' chambers gave rise to new calls for an appointed rather than elected court, something the state of Iowa, I think, is familiar with. Passage of our state budget in June also contributed to our polarized politics. For instance, as part of their plan to eliminate the deficit, the governor and Republicans made deep cuts in spending on public education, but they voted to expand support for voucher schools. There were more tax breaks for businesses. Democrats cried foul. They blasted the state's priorities. Republicans responded very bluntly. They said, yes, balancing the budget was painful. But they said, we eliminated the deficit without laying anyone off. We eliminated the deficit without any general tax increases. We did what we had to do. They said the message that was going out to business people and to entrepreneurs was that Wisconsin was a good state in which to do business. And as proof that their agenda was working, the governor and a number of his Republican colleagues cited publications and surveys that showed, yes, the state was moving up slightly as in its perception as a place to do business. So by now, Democrats had to decide, what do we do? And they decided the only way they would be able to stop the Republicans in their legislative agenda would be to change the math. And they turned to a strategy that is rarely used in other parts of the country: legislative recall elections. Only 18 states have laws that permit them, and we're one of them. Our law in Wisconsin does not require malfeasance in office. If you don't like a lawmaker's vote on a position, an issue, you don't like their style, if they've been in office for a year, and if you can collect the necessary signatures to get on the ballot, you can have a recall election. It's pretty wide open. Even so, what happened in our state was absolutely unprecedented. The numbers I've seen indicate that since 1908, there have been 21 legislative recall elections in the entire country up until last summer. 21 in the entire country. Last summer in Wisconsin, we had 9 recall elections. 6 involved Republicans who had voted for the changes in the collective bargaining provisions. 3 involved Democrats who had fled the state. But even here, in this world we live, in this world in which we live, there was a twist to this historic election cycle. To buy more time for the Republican candidates who were the targets of recall to campaign, because they were still working on the budget and they couldn't be out on the campaign trail. Little-known Republicans, people you'd never heard of, ran as phony Democrats or as protest candidates. That forced primary elections to be held in our state. When the recalls were finished, Democrats, and that was in August, middle of August, when they were finished, Democrats had narrowed the gap in our state Senate from a 19-14 Republican majority to a 17-16 Republican majority. Democrats spun that as a win, but I can also tell you that they said prior to that they expected to retake the Senate, and they did not. What they did do, though, is by making it a 17-16 majority, they, in many respects, gave new power to more moderate Republican lawmakers. And I want to say that we're not done with recalls in Wisconsin. Last week, a little-known individual announced an effort aimed at recalling Governor Walker, although, as I'll explain in a moment, that's not what it appears to be either. But the major recall effort will begin 5 days from now. A group called United Wisconsin, that's a citizens group, and the Democratic Party of Wisconsin will launch their massive effort to recall the governor. They'll have to collect more than 540,000 signatures in just 60 days to force a recall election. While that is certainly not easy, everyone concedes that, and there will undoubtedly be a number of legal challenges, the governor is preparing as if there will be a recall election. And if there is, the Democrats are likely to try to make it about more than collective bargaining. A lot of our legislative recall elections began as an argument about collective bargaining, but they quickly morphed into a discussion of what was done in the budget, what was done on redistricting, issues like that. So I think the Democrats will try to make this about more than collective bargaining. The state's unemployment rate has inched up since the governor took office, from 7.5% to 7.8%. Jobs are being created at a slower rate than the governor predicted. There's also this is kind of a wild card. There's a John Doe probe focusing on former staffers to the governor when he was Milwaukee County executive. It's looking into whether some of those individuals may have done political work on the taxpayer's dime. Now, it's not yet clear who would be the Democratic candidate in a recall election featuring the governor. Senator Feingold, our former senator from Wisconsin, fares the best in polling. He actually is ahead of Governor Walker in a head-to-head matchup, but Senator Feingold, who's a colleague of mine at the law school, incidentally, has said he is not running. He will not be a candidate in that election, should there be one. Some people see a possible rematch of Scott Walker and Tom Barrett, the mayor of Milwaukee. The mayor has not ruled that out. Some have even mentioned former Congressman David Obey. Then there are others who suggest a relative newcomer might be a good idea, perhaps a business person who's a job creator but doesn't have a lot of political baggage. But I think the sense you get is that for a significant number of people who support the recall in the state of Wisconsin, this would be an ABW election, anybody but Walker. In addition to the governor and that potential recall, Democrats are planning to target at least 3 more Republican state senators for recall. Republicans say they may respond in kind, and Democrats are also targeting the lieutenant governor, Rebecca Clayfish, for a recall. So it's possible that when some of the folks who are out collecting signatures are doing their work, they may have to ask somebody to sign a petition 3 times, one for the governor, one for the lieutenant governor, and one for the state senator in that district. So I guess the question we all ask is where will the state go from here? Or as Congressman Ryan asks, is this indeed the new normal? No one seems to have a clear answer to that question, but here are some observations about where we are in Wisconsin today. First, the Democrats and the Republicans are locked in an intense and bitter philosophical struggle that will determine the future direction of the state. But even if Democrats were able to unseat the governor, even if they were able to regain control of one of the houses or both of the houses, it would take time for them to unwind some of the changes, dramatic changes that we've seen in our state. Republicans have been remarkably disciplined and have had remarkable success in moving their legislative agenda forward. They balanced the budget. They gave tax breaks to businesses. The elimination of collective bargaining provisions gave a number of school districts at least a one-time temporary respite from rising employee benefit costs. Republicans passed a strict voter ID law. They passed a controversial redistricting measure, which should make Republican seats even safer. That's being challenged in court. They also approved a concealed carry weapon law. For instance, you can now carry, under our new law, you can now carry a concealed weapon into the state capitol. Republicans, in fact, have remade Wisconsin. But the question is, have they overreached, and will they pay the price politically? We saw what happened in Ohio this week. There are people asking whether the same thing or something similar will happen in the state of Wisconsin. Second, there is likely to be little compromise in the state legislature in the months ahead. More than one legislative leader has told me that the current atmosphere remains toxic. Work remains to be done on two important job initiatives in Wisconsin. One involves a mining regulations bill, another is the creation of a venture capital fund in our state. But agreement on meaningful jobs legislation may have to wait as the prospective recalls move front and center. Third, the public is every bit as divided as state lawmakers. Last week, Bloomberg Business Week named Wisconsin the Republic of Political Unhappiness. Our citizens may not be in the primal scream stage as they were last spring, but poll after poll shows an even split between those who think the governor should be recalled and those who think he should not be recalled. And in those 9 recall elections that were held last summer, the total number of votes cast was almost evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. Fourth, money, especially outside money, is influencing Wisconsin politics like never before. Here's a number for you, $44 million. $44 million. That's how much the political watchdog group, the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, estimates was spent on just the 9 recall elections last summer. $44 million. These are for jobs that pay about $50,000 a year. And keep in mind that under Wisconsin law, the governor can raise unlimited sums of money during the 60-day period when signatures in the recall drive are being collected. If there is a recall, money will again pour into the state in record amounts. The Wisconsin Democracy Campaign last week estimated that as much as $100 million could be spent in Wisconsin on a recall election involving our governor. Fifth, the recall in Wisconsin, at least for now, is a political weapon to be reckoned with. I don't know if you'd call it the weapon of first resort, but it's definitely not the weapon of last resort. Created in 1926, the law was used very infrequently until this past year. But will the public grow weary of it? That's the big question. It gives citizens the ability to change course, to change direction, but does it discourage public servants from taking a courageous stand? Will they run for cover every time a controversial issue emerges? A prominent Republican lawmaker is proposing a change in the state constitution requiring malfeasance in office before a recall can be launched. He says he's looking for Democratic support for the idea. He hasn't found any, and the measure hasn't gone anywhere. Sixth, civil discourse is eroding not just in the legislature, but in public. We've had a spate of death threats, some more troubling than others. Yesterday, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel reported that the security detail costs for the governor hit $600,000 for the first 10 months of this year. That's well over 2 times as much as was spent for the Democratic governor who preceded him. At a hotel lounge in Madison not too long ago, one of the prominent Republican lawmakers had a beer dumped over his head by an unhappy protester. I think as you have experienced in Iowa recently, Governor Walker is greeted by protesters just about every place he goes. At the opening of the Wisconsin State Fair this summer, he was shouted down by demonstrators yelling shame. At a Special Olympics event just outside the Capitol, protesters stood up during remarks by the governor, turning their back to him and obstructing those who had gathered for the Special Olympics event. Blogs and the comment sections following newspaper stories routinely in our state refer to Democrats as tools of union thugs, while Republicans are routinely dismissed as right-wing extremists. The rhetoric in our state remains white-hot, and it's stoked to some degree by the political parties themselves. A case in point is what happened in Wisconsin last week. I mentioned that a little-known individual launched a recall effort against the governor. It turns out that that individual has actually donated money small sums of money to the governor and to Republican causes in the past, and that the real reason, apparently, for the recall was to open that window that allows the governor to raise unlimited funds. It gives him another 10 days, essentially, to raise money. That incident drew the following reaction from the state Democratic Party, which I'll quote. This is from the party chair. Given the shady, underhanded, and even downright criminal, dirty tricks to deny democracy we have seen out of Scott Walker's Republican Party and the extremist groups who finance his rent-to-own government, this latest ploy to bolster Scott Walker's recall campaign with unlimited special interest cash is unfortunately not a shock. End of quote. These sorts of releases are common. They're almost everyday occurrences in the state of Wisconsin. Now, that's not to say there aren't a few folks in the state who are trying to find a way to work together. Two Wisconsin lawmakers, Democratic Senator Tim Cullen, he's a former businessman from the Janesville area, and Republican Senator Dale Schultz, who's from southwestern Wisconsin. They've been touring the state together on what they call their Common Ground Tour. They're talking about a shared agenda, working together on legislation. For example, they're the ones who want to sponsor a constitutional amendment that would have our Supreme Court justices appointed rather than elected. Senator Schultz even wants to change the seating patterns in the state capitol. He wants Democrats and Republicans, we talk about the small things that can be done, he wants Democrats and Republicans to sit next to each other instead of sitting in voting blocks. And he said, you'd be surprised when you find out that the person next to you is actually a pretty nice guy or a pretty nice woman. It just changes the way you do business. So change is small and change is big. But so far, I have to tell you, there are few signs that other lawmakers are willing to join them in their crusade. During an appearance recently at our law school, I asked them if this notion of compromise and collaboration wasn't somehow a quaint notion in today's political world. And they said they were sure that some people would see it that way. Incidentally, Senator Schultz, the lone Republican senator to vote against the collective bargaining legislation, and one of the senators who sometimes breaks ranks from his fellow Republicans, he had his Capitol office egged the other day. He says he may end up being the only lawmaker targeted for recall by both Democrats and Republicans. In closing, I'm not here to suggest that it will always be such in Wisconsin. This could well just be a moment in history. Wisconsin Republicans and Democrats have disagreed in the past. They've disagreed vigorously. But as someone who has lived in the state for most of my life, covered politics for a lot of years, this year has definitely been different. The never-ending election cycles, the tone of the discourse, the enormous sums of money being spent. And speaking of which, I will end with a story from last summer's recall elections. I was interviewing Ken Goldstein, the political scientist from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who is now heading a private research firm in Washington, D.C. Ken was analyzing the latest TV ad buys in a recall race in northwestern Wisconsin. We're talking about the fact that more than $2 million had been spent in the Twin Cities market for television advertising. And yet, as Ken reminded our audience, only 4% of the people watching Twin Cities television actually lived in the Wisconsin district where the election was being held. Ken figured only half of those would probably bother to vote. And of those who would go to the polls, he wondered how many had already made up their minds or would even be influenced by the advertising. Just think about that for a moment. More than $2 million for what was likely to be no more than a few dozen votes, maybe fewer, in a race that was never very close. If that's the new normal in Wisconsin, we are in for a very wild ride indeed. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.